A bankrupt millionaire finds a safe buried on the street of his old company. While investigating, he discovers secrets linking his family to a dark past. His search sparks dangerous interests and betrayals from those close to him. Now he must uncover the truth before it's too late. If this story caught your interest, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching us from. The sun was setting on the horizon, painting the sky of Chicago with shades of orange and red as Richard Anderson walked through the streets of what was once a thriving business district. His footsteps echoed on the empty sidewalks, a lonely reminder of the empire he had built and lost. The suit he wore, once impeccable, was now wrinkled and worn, much like his own life. Richard stopped in front of the imposing building that once housed the headquarters of Anderson Enterprises. The sign, once bright, was now covered in a thin layer of dust, the golden letters almost illegible. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the memories flood his mind. The intense negotiations, the handshakes that sealed million-dollar deals, the buzz of employees in the hallways. Everything had disappeared in a matter of months. The bankruptcy was not just financial but also emotional. Richard had lost not only his fortune but his identity. Who was he now, without the title of CEO? Without the luxury cars, the international trips, the dinners at Michelin-starred restaurants? As he pondered these unanswered questions, his gaze was drawn to something unusual on the cracked sidewalk near the building. A small metallic object glinted faintly under the twilight, partially buried in the dirt. Intrigued, Richard crouched, down to investigate. With trembling hands, he began to dig. The dirt was damp and sticky, but he didn't mind getting his hands dirty. Hands that once only touched important documents and expensive computer keyboards. The more he dug, the more the object revealed itself. It was a small safe, surprisingly heavy. Richard looked around, half expecting someone to appear and claim the find. But the street remained deserted, as if the world had forgotten that piece of the city just as it had forgotten him. With effort, he pulled the safe from the ground. The metal surface was corroded by time, but still maintained a solidity that intrigued him. Without a second thought, Richard tucked the safe under his arm and began walking toward his apartment. Not the luxurious penthouse he once owned, but a small studio he had rented in haste after the bankruptcy. The entire way his mind buzzed with possibilities. What could be inside the safe? Money, documents, jewelry. He tried to temper his expectations, bitterly remembering how excessive optimism had led to his downfall. When he arrived home, Richard placed the safe on the kitchen table and examined it meticulously. There were no visible marks or inscriptions, just a sturdy lock that seemed to defy any attempt to open it. For hours he tried everything. Old keys, paper clips, even a small jackhammer he borrowed from the building superintendent. Nothing worked. The safe remained stubbornly closed, guarding its secrets. Exhausted and frustrated, Richard collapsed onto the couch, staring at the object that now seemed to mock him. It was then that he noticed something. A small scratch on the side of the safe, almost imperceptible. Driven by impulse, he pressed the spot firmly. To his surprise, he heard a soft click. The lid of the safe opened slowly, as if reluctant to reveal its contents after so many years of secrecy. With his heart racing, Richard leaned in. The inside of the safe was dark and dusty. He held his breath as he reached for the first object, an antique watch, its face covered in a thin layer of dust. The gears were frozen in time. Next, his fingers touched something thin and brittle, a faded photograph. He held it up to the light, trying to make out the figures. They were people in formal attire, in a setting he didn't recognize. Turning the photo over, Richard noticed an enigmatic handwritten phrase on the back. "You knew too much, now it's too late." A shiver ran down his spine. Who were these people? And what did that threatening message mean? The third item was a yellowed piece of paper, its edges burned. As he carefully unfolded it, Richard realized it was a fragment of a map. Some markings and street names were visible, but much of it was illegible or missing. Finally, at the bottom of the safe, there was a key. It wasn't an ordinary key. Its design was intricate, with engraved markings on the metal that Richard couldn't decipher. It didn't look like any key he had ever seen before. Richard spread the objects out on the table, his mind spinning. At first glance, they seemed worthless, old worn items that could easily be discarded as trash, but something about them intrigued him deeply. There was a story there, he could feel it. A story that, for some reason, someone had wanted to hide. As he examined the objects more closely, Richard began to notice details that made him even more curious. The watch, though old, was from a rare and valuable brand. He vaguely remembered seeing a similar one in old photos of his grandfather. The photograph, though faded, showed people who seemed important. Their attire and posture suggested power and influence. And that phrase on the back, it was clearly a threat. But to whom? And why? The map, even incomplete, seemed to indicate an area not far from the city. Richard tried to imagine what could be hidden there, what secret was so important that someone had burned part of the map. And the key, it was a mystery in itself. The engraved markings seemed to form some kind of code or message. Richard was sure that if he could decipher them, they would lead him to something important. The more he looked at these seemingly unrelated objects, the more Richard felt he had stumbled upon something much bigger than he could imagine. It was as if the past was trying to tell him something, whispering long-buried secrets. That night, Richard barely slept. His mind buzzed with possibilities and theories. He wondered if this discovery could be the key to understanding not just the mystery of the safe, but also the events that led to the downfall of his business empire. The next morning, determined to unravel the mystery, Richard began his investigation. He knew he needed to be cautious. If the message on the photograph meant anything, there was danger involved in this mystery. His first stop was the public library. There he hoped to find information about the city's history that could shed light on the map and the photograph. As he flipped through books and old archives, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Several times he glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see someone observing him. But the library was nearly empty, just a few students absorbed in their studies. As the day progressed, Richard felt he was only scratching the surface of something much larger. Each small discovery led to more questions, and he had a growing sense that time was running out. When he returned home that night, laden with notes and more questions than answers, Richard looked again at the objects from the safe. They seemed to stare back at him, stubbornly guarding their secrets. He picked up the watch, turning it over in his hands. It was then that he noticed something he had missed before. A small inscription on the back of the face. With his heart racing, Richard grabbed a magnifying glass to examine it more closely. The engraved words were almost microscopic but clear. The truth lies where it all began. Richard felt a shiver run down his spine. He knew instinctively that he had just found the first real clue. The question now was, where had it all begun? And what truth was waiting to be discovered? With this new revelation, Richard realized he was at the beginning of a journey that could change everything, a journey that would lead him to confront not only the secrets hidden in that safe, but also the secrets of his own past and the city he thought he knew so well. As night fell over Chicago, Richard prepared to dive deeper into the mystery. He didn't know what he would find, but he was determined to follow this path to the end, no matter where it led. Dawn found Richard already awake, his eyes red from a sleepless night. The phrase engraved on the watch, "The truth lies where it all began," echoed in his mind like an incessant mantra. He knew he needed to decipher this riddle, and there was only one logical place to start: the history of his own family. With a deep sigh, Richard picked up the phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. After a few rings, a familiar voice answered. "Hello? Aunt Amelia, it's Richard." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Richard? My God, it's been so long. Is everything okay?" The concern in his aunt's voice made Richard realize how much he had distanced himself from his family after his business success and subsequent fall. "Yes, Aunt Amelia. I need your help. It's about Grandpa." Aunt Amelia, his father's younger sister, had always been the keeper of the family stories. If anyone could help him understand the connection between his grandfather and the mysterious objects, it was her. Hours later, Richard found himself sitting in the cozy living room of Aunt Amelia's house, surrounded by dusty photo albums and boxes filled with family mementos. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, bringing a comforting sense of home he hadn't felt in a long time. "Your grandfather, Augustus, was a fascinating man," Aunt Amelia began, her eyes glimmering. "With distant memories, he came to America as a young man with little more than the clothes on his back and a lot of dreams." Richard listened intently, absorbing every word. He knew his grandfather had been an immigrant, but he had never been particularly interested in the details of his story. At first, Augustus worked various jobs to survive, but he had a natural talent for business, Aunt Amelia continued. That's how he met Jerome Evans. The name made Richard sit up straight. Jerome Evans was the original founder of the company he had inherited and expanded, the same company that now lay in ruins. Aunt Amelia picked up a particularly old photo album and opened it. "Look, here's your grandfather with Jerome." Richard took the photograph with trembling hands. The image showed two young men smiling in front of a small warehouse. One of them was unmistakably his grandfather, Augustus. The other, presumably Jerome, was wearing a watch that Richard immediately recognized. It was identical to the one he had found in the safe. "Aunt Amelia, what do you know about this watch?" Richard asked, barely disguising the emotion in his voice. Aunt Amelia frowned, thoughtful. "Jerome's watch? Well, it was a unique piece from what I remember. Your grandfather always said that watch held more than just time." Richard felt his heart race. "And what happened to Jerome?" Aunt Amelia's expression darkened. "Ah, that's a sad story. Jerome disappeared mysteriously just a few years after. Founding the company with your grandfather, he was never found." A heavy silence fell over the room. Richard tried to process this new information. Jerome's disappearance, the mysterious watch, the enigmatic phrase on the photograph from the safe, it all seemed connected somehow. "Richard," Aunt Amelia said, interrupting his thoughts, "there's something you need to see." She stood up and went to an old trunk in the corner of the room. After rummaging for a few moments, she returned with a yellowed envelope. "Your grandfather gave this to me before he died. He said it was to be given to the first person in the family who asked the right questions." She handed the envelope to Richard. "I think that moment has come." With trembling hands, Richard opened the envelope. Inside, he found a handwritten letter and an old key, not the same one from the safe, but equally intriguing. The letter began, "My dear grandson, if you are reading this, it means the past has finally caught up with you. There are secrets in our family and in the history of our company that have been buried for too long. Secrets that I helped hide out of fear and duty. But now it is time for the truth to come to light. The key that accompanies this letter opens a hidden compartment in the old company headquarters. There you will find the beginning of the answers you seek, but I must warn you, this path is dangerous. There are powerful people who will do anything to keep the past buried. Remember, not everything is as it seems. Trust your instincts, but be cautious of who you trust. The truth lies where it all began. With love, your grandfather, Augustus." Richard reread the letter several times, his mind spinning with the implications. He looked at Aunt Amelia, who was watching him with a mix of concern and curiosity. "Aunt Amelia, did you know about this?" She shook her head. "No, dear, your grandfather just asked me to keep the envelope. I never knew what was inside." Richard stood up, feeling a sudden urgency. He needed to go to the old company headquarters immediately. But before he could move, Aunt Amelia grabbed his arm. "Richard, be careful. Your grandfather was a good man, but he carried many burdens. Whatever you discover, remember that things aren't always black and white." He nodded, grateful for the warning. After hugging his aunt tightly, Richard stepped out into the street, his mind filled with new questions and possibilities. The walk to the old Anderson Enterprises headquarters felt longer than ever. Richard couldn't help but glance over his shoulder occasionally, the feeling of being watched stronger than ever. When he finally arrived at the abandoned building, the sun was already setting, casting long, uneasy shadows through the empty hallways. Richard hesitated for a moment before inserting the key into the front door lock. With a soft click, the door opened. The interior of the building was dusty and silent, a ghost of its former glory. Richard walked through the hallways, his footsteps echoing disturbingly. He made his way to the main office, the place where, according to family stories, it had all begun. In the office, Richard examined every inch, searching for something that could be opened by his grandfather's key. After what felt like hours of fruitless searching, he was about to give up when he noticed something strange in the baseboard. Behind the old CEO's desk, crouching down, Richard noticed a small crack, almost imperceptible. With his heart racing, he inserted the key. It fit perfectly. As he turned the key, he heard a soft click and a secret panel opened in the floor. Inside, there was a metal box similar to a small safe. Richard carefully lifted the box, feeling its considerable weight. It was locked, but he had a hunch. Taking the key he had found in the original safe, he inserted it into the box's lock. The lid opened with a creak, revealing its contents: a stack of old documents, yellowed photographs, and a leather-bound diary. As Richard began to examine the documents, a sudden noise made him freeze. Footsteps. Someone was in the building. Quickly, he closed the box and hid it in his backpack. His heart pounding, Richard prepared to face whatever or whoever was approaching. The footsteps grew louder, closer. A shadow appeared in the office doorway. Richard held his breath, his mind racing with possibilities. Was it someone connected to the secrets he was unearthing? A night guard? Or something much more sinister? The doorknob began to turn slowly. Time seemed to drag as Richard watched, paralyzed, while the doorknob turned. His heart was beating so loudly he feared the sound might give him away. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a figure emerging from the shadows. "Carl?" Richard exclaimed, incredulous. Carl Miller, his former personal assistant, stood in the doorway, looking just as surprised as Richard. "Mr. Anderson? What are you doing here?" Richard hesitated, his mind racing to find a plausible explanation. I came to get some old documents, and you?" Carl seemed nervous, his eyes darting around the office. Well, I've been doing some security gigs. I heard a noise and came to check." Something about Carl's explanation didn't sit right with Richard, but he decided not to press the issue. After all, he wasn't being entirely honest either. "Well, everything's fine here," Richard said, forcing a smile. "Just me, digging through old memories." Carl nodded, still looking uncomfortable. "Of course, sir. I'll get back to my rounds then. Have a good night." After Carl left, Richard waited a few minutes, his heart still racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that the encounter wasn't a coincidence. Deciding not to risk staying any longer, he grabbed his backpack and quickly left the building, careful not to be seen. Back in his small apartment, Richard spread the contents of the box on the table. Under the dim light of a lamp, he began to examine the documents. Most were old financial papers, contracts, and internal memos from the company. But mixed in were more intriguing documents, reports on people seemingly unrelated to the business, transcripts of secretly recorded conversations, and what appeared to be an elaborate code used in some correspondence. The photographs showed clandestine meetings, faces Richard recognized from old newspapers and history books, influential politicians, powerful businessmen, all captured in moments that seemed compromising. But it was the diary that truly captured his attention. It was the personal diary of Jerome Evans, his grandfather's missing partner. With trembling hands, Richard opened the diary and began to read. March 15th, 1962. Today, we took the first step towards something greater than I ever imagined. The society was formed. We are 12, all sworn to loyalty to each other and to the cause. Augustus hesitated, but in the end, he understood the necessity. America needs a steady hand guiding its economic destiny. Away from the public eye, our company will be just the facade. Behind it, we will shape the future of this country. Richard felt a chill run down his spine. The society Jerome mentioned sounded like something out of a conspiracy theory. But there it was, documented in ink and paper. As he read on, the truth began to unfold. Anderson Enterprises, the company his grandfather had helped found and that Richard had inherited, wasn't just a business. It was a front for a secret organization that had been manipulating the country's economy and politics for decades. The diary entries detailed secret meetings, shady deals, and complex financial operations that went far beyond the scope of a normal company. Names of prominent politicians, judges, and businessmen appeared frequently, all seemingly part of this web of influence and power. But as Richard progressed through the diary, he noticed a shift in Jerome's tone. The more recent entries expressed doubt and regret. September 10th, 1965. I can no longer continue with this. What began as a mission to guide the country has turned into something monstrous. Greed has corrupted the society. Augustus agrees with me. We must expose the truth, no matter the cost. The last entry was dated just 2 days before Jerome's recorded disappearance, September 15th, 1965. I've gathered all the evidence. Tomorrow, I will hand everything over to the authorities. Augustus warned me about the risks, but there's no other way. If something happens to me, may the truth find its way to the light. Richard closed the diary, his mind spinning with the implications. His grandfather and Jerome had planned to expose the society, but only Jerome disappeared. What had really happened? As he pondered this question, Richard heard a sound that made his blood run cold. Footsteps in the hallway outside his apartment. Footsteps that stopped right in front of his door. Quickly he began gathering the scattered documents, his heart pounding in his chest. Before he could finish, there was a loud knock on the door. "Mr. Anderson? Police, open the door, please." Richard froze, his mind racing to find a way out. How had the police found him? What did they want? The knock came again, more insistent this time. "Mr. Anderson, we have a warrant. Open the door now, or we'll be forced to break it down." With trembling hands, Richard hid the diary and the most incriminating documents in a bag. He knew he had no choice but to open the door, but he also knew he couldn't let them find what he had discovered. Taking a deep breath, he approached the door. His hand hovered over the doorknob for a moment as he considered his options. Opening. The door meant facing the unknown, but resisting would only make things worse. With one last glance at the bag where he had hidden the evidence, Richard turned the knob. The door opened, revealing 2 stern-faced police officers. "Richard Anderson?" the taller one asked. Richard nodded, trying to maintain his composure. "Yes, that's me. What's this about?" The shorter officer stepped forward, holding a piece of paper. "We have a warrant to search your apartment, sir. There are allegations of possession of stolen documents from Anderson Enterprises." Richard's heart sank. Someone knew what he had found and was trying to stop him. But who and how had they found out so quickly? As the officers entered his apartment, Richard tried to stay calm. He knew what he had discovered was much bigger than a simple police investigation. The truth about the society, about his grandfather, about Jerome's fate, it was all at stake. The officers began methodically searching the small apartment, opening drawers and cabinets. Richard watched, tense, praying they wouldn't find the bag where he had hidden the most important documents. It was then that he noticed something strange. The shorter officer seemed to be searching specific places, as if he knew exactly what he was looking for. His movements were precise, focused. A sudden realization hit Richard. These weren't ordinary cops. They were looking for something specific, the documents he had found in the abandoned office. At that moment, the shorter officer's gaze fixed on the hidden bag. He moved toward it with purpose. Richard knew he had to act fast. If they found those documents, everything would be lost. Not just the evidence, but possibly his only chance to uncover the truth about his past and the fate of his company. With his heart racing, Richard made a decision that would change the course of his life forever. He needed to find a way out of this situation with the documents, no matter the cost. As the officer reached for the bag, Richard prepared to do something he never imagined he was capable of. The fate of many, perhaps even the entire country, depended on what would happen in the next few moments. The tension in the small apartment was palpable. Richard knew he was about to cross a line from which there would be no return, but with the truth so close to being revealed, he had no choice. The officer was just steps away from the bag now, his hand reaching out. In the moment, the officer's hand was about to touch the bag, Richard acted on pure instinct. With a quick motion, He grabbed a potted plant from the nearby table and hurled it toward the window. The sound of shattering glass filled the apartment, startling both officers. Taking advantage of the momentary distraction, Richard grabbed the bag with the documents and bolted for the door. The taller officer tried to block him, but Richard, fueled by adrenaline, managed to dodge and slip past him. "Stop, police!" one of the men shouted, but Richard was already in the hallway, running like he had never run before. He flew down the stairs, leaping steps, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might explode. Behind him, he could hear the heavy footsteps of the officers and their shouts echoing through the stairwell. When he reached the ground floor, Richard saw the exit door and ran toward it. But to his dismay, it was locked. Looking frantically around, he spotted an open window at the end of the hallway. Without a second thought, Richard dove through the window, landing awkwardly in a side alley. The pain of the impact shot through his body, but he couldn't stop. Quickly getting to his feet, he began running down the dark street. Sirens began to wail in the distance. Richard knew he had only minutes before the entire city's police force would be after him. He needed a place to hide, to think. As he ran through the streets of Chicago, his mind worked frantically. Where could he go? Who could help him? It was then that he remembered. Emily, his ex-girlfriend. She was an investigative journalist and always said she had contacts who could help in tricky situations. She was his only hope. After what felt like hours of running and hiding in the shadows, Richard finally arrived at Emily's building. Panting and trembling, he rang the doorbell. Emily opened the door, her eyes widening in surprise at the sight of Richard. "My God! Richard, what happened to you?" "Emily, I need your help," he gasped, quickly stepping inside the apartment. "I'm in danger. The police are after me, but it's not what it seems." Emily looked at him with a mix of concern and curiosity. "Calm. Tell me everything from the beginning." In the next few minutes, Richard recounted everything that had happened. The safe he found, the documents he discovered, the secret society, and the fake police operation. Emily listened intently, her face growing more serious with each revelation. When Richard finished, she was silent for a moment, processing everything. "Richard, what you've uncovered is explosive," she finally said. "If it's true, this could shake the very foundations of power in the entire country." "I know," he replied, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "But what do I do now? I can't just turn myself into the police. They're not trustworthy." Emily thought for a moment. "I have a contact in the FBI, someone I trust. We can reach out to him, but we need to be extremely careful." While Emily made some calls, Richard opened the bag and began examining the documents again. It was then that he noticed something he had missed before, a series of numbers and letters handwritten in the corner of one of the photographs. "Emily, look at this," he called. "It looks like some kind of code." Emily approached, examining the inscription. Her eyes lit up with recognition. "Wait a minute. This looks like coordinates for an old filing system used in some libraries and historical archives." "Do you think it could lead us to more information?" Richard asked, feeling a spark of hope. "Possibly. But we'd need to access the city archives, and I'm sure the police will be watching all the obvious places." At that moment, Emily's phone rang. She answered, speaking in low tones for a few minutes before hanging up. "It was my FBI contact," she said. "He confirms that the operation against you wasn't official. Someone is using the local police for their own purposes." Richard felt a shiver run down his spine. "So it's true. The society still exists, and they're after me." Emily nodded gravely. "It seems so. My contact said he can give us cover for a few hours, but we need to act fast." "What do we do now?" Richard asked, feeling completely lost. "First, we need to ensure your safety," Emily replied, already in action mode. "I know a place where you can hide for now. Then we'll try to decipher this code and see where it leads us." As they prepared to leave, Richard couldn't help but feel a mix of fear and determination. He knew he was getting into something much bigger than he had ever imagined, but he also knew he couldn't turn back now. "Emily," he said softly, "thank you for helping me. I know I'm putting you in danger too." Emily smiled, a glint of adventure in her eyes. Hey, it's not every day we get to unravel a conspiracy that could change the country. Besides, she added with a touch of humor, I always thought you looked good on the run. Richard couldn't help but smile slightly, despite the gravity of the situation. As they prepared to step out into the Chicago night, he knew they were about to embark on a dangerous journey, but also one that could be transformative. The distant sound of sirens reminded them of the urgency of their situation. Quickly, they gathered the documents and some essential supplies. Ready? Emily asked, her hand on the doorknob. Richard nodded, adjusting the strap of the bag on his shoulder. Ready. Together they stepped out into the night, diving into a world of shadows and secrets that threatened to swallow them whole. But with each step, Richard felt his determination grow. He would uncover the truth no matter the cost. As they walked quickly through the dark streets, avoiding the more illuminated and busy areas, Richard couldn't help but think about how drastically his life had changed in such a short time. From a bankrupt businessman to a fugitive chasing a national conspiracy, it was almost surreal. Emily guided them through a series of alleys and side streets, clearly familiar with the lesser-known paths of the city. After about half an hour of tense walking, they arrived at an old building in a quiet neighborhood. This is it, Emily whispered, typing a code into a panel beside the door. A friend of mine is the caretaker. He'll let us use one of the empty apartments for a while. Once inside the dark and dusty apartment, Richard finally felt the weight of the day's events crash down on him. Exhausted, he sat on an old couch while Emily checked that the windows were securely closed. Rest a little, she said, her voice soft. Tomorrow we'll start deciphering that code and see where it leads us. Richard nodded, grateful for the chance to catch his breath, but even as he lay down, his mind continued to race. Who were the current members of the society? How far did their influence reach? And most importantly, what was the true story behind Jerome's disappearance and his grandfather's involvement? As sleep finally claimed him, Richard knew that the answers to these questions could change not only his life, but potentially the fate of the entire country. And he was determined to discover them no matter the cost. Dawn found Richard and Emily already awake, hunched over the makeshift table in the small apartment. The code they had found on the photograph was written on a piece of paper in the center, surrounded by scribbled notes and theories. CLB 1965 AJ 237, Emily murmured, running her fingers through her hair in frustration. We must be missing something. Richard nodded, rubbing his tired eyes. They had spent most of the night trying to crack the code. CLB probably stands for collection, right? And 1965 must be the year. Yes, that seems obvious, Emily agreed. But AJ? And what does that number at the end mean? At that moment, Emily's phone vibrated. She picked it up cautiously, relaxing slightly when she saw the name on the screen. It's my FBI contact, she explained before answering. Richard E. watched anxiously as Emily spoke in low tones. Her expression shifted between concern and relief. Okay, got it. Thanks for the heads up, she said before hanging up. Turning to Richard, she explained, The search for you has been officially suspended, but my contact says there are strange movements behind the scenes. Someone powerful is pushing to keep the investigation going unofficially. Richard felt a chill run down his spine. The society, he murmured. Emily nodded gravely. Probably, but that also means we're on the right track. They wouldn't be so desperate to stop us if we didn't have something important. Turning their attention back to the code, Emily suddenly widened her eyes. Wait a minute. What if AJ isn't an acronym, but a name? A name? Richard asked, confused. Yes, AJ, Augustus, and Jerome, Emily exclaimed, her voice full of excitement. Your grandfather and his partner. The realization hit Richard like a lightning bolt. Of course! They must have hidden something in the city archives under their own names. With renewed energy, they went back to examining the code. So if we're right, this points to a document in the 1965 collection related to Augustus and Jerome, number 237, Emily summarized. But how do we access those archives? Richard asked. Surely they'll be watching places like that. Emily smiled, a glint of determination in her eyes. Leave that to me. I have some contacts in the archives department. We might not be able, To get in personally, but maybe we can convince someone to take a look for us. In the hours that followed, Emily made a series of calls, speaking in codes and using names Richard didn't recognize. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she hung up the phone with a triumphant smile. "I did it," she announced. "An old friend is going to check the archives for us. He'll send us photos of what he finds." The wait was agonizing. Richard couldn't sit still, alternating between pacing and anxiously looking out the window, always alert for any suspicious movement on the street. Finally, Emily's phone beeped. She picked it up quickly, swiping across the screen. "It's the photos," she said, her voice tense with anticipation. Richard leaned in, looking over Emily's shoulder as she scrolled through the images. They were old documents, some almost illegible due to age. "There!" Richard exclaimed, pointing to one of the photos. It was a contract, dated 1965, with the signatures of Augustus Anderson and Jerome Evans at the bottom. Emily zoomed in on the image, her eyes scanning the text. "This is interesting," she murmured. "It looks like a land purchase agreement. But look at these clauses. They're odd for a simple real estate deal." Richard read the document, feeling his heart race. The clauses mentioned special operations and restricted access, terms too vague for a normal contract. "There's more," Emily said, moving to the next photo. It was a map showing a rural area on the outskirts of Chicago. A location was marked with a red X. "That place," Richard murmured, a flash of recognition in his eyes. "I think I've heard of it. It was an old family property, but it was abandoned years ago." Emily looked at him, her eyes shining with determination. "Well, it looks like we've just found our next destination." Richard hesitated. "Emily, this is dangerous. We don't know what we'll find there or who might be watching the place." She took his hand, squeezing it gently. "I know. But we're so close now we can't back out." He nodded slowly, knowing she was right. They had come too far to turn back now. "Okay," he said finally. "How do we get there without being noticed?" Emily smiled, a glint of adventure in her eyes. "Leave. That to me. I've got a few tricks up my sleeve." As they began planning their trip to the mysterious property, Richard couldn't help but feel a mix of fear and excitement. Each step was taking them deeper into the mystery, closer to the truth that could change everything. As the day progressed, they prepared meticulously. Emily used her contacts to arrange a rental car under a fake name. Richard studied old maps of the area, trying to memorize alternate routes in case they needed a quick escape. Night fell over Chicago, and with it came the time for departure. Richard looked one last time at the small apartment that had been his refuge for the past 24 hours. So much had changed in such a short time. "Ready?" Emily asked, holding a small backpack with supplies. Richard took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the bag with the documents on his shoulder. "Ready?" he replied. Together, they stepped out into the night, blending into the shadows of the city. The car waited a few blocks away, a common model. That wouldn't draw attention. As Emily skillfully navigated the streets of Chicago, avoiding main routes, Richard couldn't help but think about how his life had transformed. From a bankrupt businessman to a conspiracy investigator, fleeing from the law and a secret society. The city faded behind them, the lights dimming as they entered the darkness of the rural road. The silence between them was heavy with anticipation and apprehension. "What do you think we'll find there?" Richard asked finally, breaking the silence. Emily kept her eyes on the road, but Richard could see the tension in her jaw. "I don't know," she admitted, "but whatever it is, I'm sure it will be the key to unraveling this whole mystery." The hours passed slowly as they approached their destination. The full moon illuminated the fields around them, creating mysterious shadows that seemed to dance at the edge of the road. Finally, Emily turned off the headlights and slowed down. "It should be around here," she whispered. Richard consulted, the map in the dim light of a flashlight. "Yes, turn right on that dirt road." The car jolted on the poorly maintained road, the lack of headlights making navigation a challenge. After a few tense minutes, they saw it. An old house, partially hidden by overgrown trees. Emily stopped the car at a safe distance. "This is it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard felt his heart race. There, in that abandoned property, could be the answers he sought. The truth about his grandfather, about Jerome, about the mysterious society that seemed to control the levers of power. They got out of the car silently, their flashlights illuminating the path ahead. The house seemed to watch them, its dark windows like empty eyes. "Let's go," Emily said. Taking the first step toward the structure, Richard followed her, each step bringing them closer to the truth and potentially to danger. Whatever they found inside, he knew there was no turning back. His life, and possibly the future of the country, depended on what they would discover. On that dark night, the old wooden floor creaked under their feet as Richard and Emily cautiously entered the abandoned house. The beams of their flashlights danced across the peeling walls, revealing furniture covered in dusty sheets and crooked pictures on the walls. "It looks like no one's been here for years," Richard whispered, his gaze sweeping the room for any clues. Emily nodded, moving carefully through the living room. "That could be good or bad. Good because maybe no one's messed with what we're looking for. Bad because there might be nothing to find." They began a methodical search of the house, checking each room, every drawer, every possible hiding spot. The tension grew with each passing minute without finding anything significant. It was when they reached what appeared to be an old office that something caught Richard's attention. One of the wooden panels on the wall seemed slightly misaligned compared to the others. "Emily, look at this," he called softly, approaching the panel. Together they examined the wall. Richard pressed lightly on the panel, and to his surprise, it moved. "It's a hidden compartment," Emily exclaimed, helping Richard slide the panel aside. What they found made their hearts race, a small safe embedded in the wall. "How do we open this?" Richard asked, frustrated. Emily examined the lock for a moment. "Wait, this reminds me of something." She pulled out the key they had found in the original safe. "Could it?" With trembling hands, she inserted the key into the lock. To their astonishment, it fit perfectly. With a soft click, the safe door opened. Inside, they found a leather-bound folder, worn by time. Richard carefully lifted it, feeling the weight of history in his hands. "Let's take a look at this in a safer place," Emily suggested, glancing nervously at the windows. They quickly returned to the car, their hearts pounding with anticipation. Once inside, with the doors locked, Richard opened the folder. The contents were a mix of old documents, photographs, and what appeared to be a diary. Richard picked up one of the photos, his eyes widening in surprise. "It's my grandfather," he said, showing Emily. The photo showed Augustus Anderson alongside several important-looking men, all in formal attire. Emily examined the photo closely. "Look at the date on the back, 1967. That was after Jerome's disappearance." Richard nodded, picking up another document. It was a letter, handwritten. He began to read aloud. "My dear Augustus, if you are reading this, it means my suspicions were correct, and I couldn't complete our mission. The society has become something we never intended. Power has corrupted many of our colleagues. Trust no one. The documents I've left here are just a fraction of what I discovered. The rest is hidden where it all began. Remember our promise in college, under the old fig tree. Take care, my friend. And if you can, finish what we started. Your eternal partner, Jerome." A heavy silence fell over the car as Richard finished reading. The implications of the letter were enormous. "So Jerome didn't disappear," Emily said slowly. "He went into hiding, and he left clues for your grandfather." Richard nodded, his mind spinning. "But why didn't my grandfather ever do anything with this information? Why did he keep it all secret?" They continued to examine the documents, finding fragments of information that painted a disturbing picture. The society, originally founded with noble intentions to guide the country's development, had transformed into a web of corruption and manipulation. "Look at this," Emily said, pointing to a list of names. "Some of these surnames are still prominent in politics and business today." Richard felt a chill run down his spine. The society's influence seemed to extend to the present day. Suddenly a beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the interior of the car. Richard and Emily instinctively ducked. "Damn," Emily whispered. "Someone's coming." The unknown car stopped a few meters away. Two figures emerged, their silhouettes visible in the moonlight. "What do we do?" Richard asked, his heart hammering in his chest. Emily quickly looked around. "We can't stay here. We have to run for the woods. Quick, grab the documents." They slipped out of the car silently, using the darkness to sneak toward the trees. The footsteps of the strangers were approaching the house. Running through the dark forest, Richard and Emily tried to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the intruders without making noise. Branches and bushes scratched their faces and arms, but they didn't dare stop. After what felt like an eternity, they finally stopped, panting, hidden behind a large rock. "I think we lost them," Emily whispered, looking back. Richard nodded, still catching his breath. "What do we do now?" Emily thought for a moment. "We need to get out of here. There's a small town a few miles away. We can try to reach it and find transportation back to Chicago." As they prepared to continue their journey through the dark forest, Richard couldn't help but think about the revelations of the night. They had discovered so much, but there were still so many unanswered questions. The mystery of his grandfather, and Jerome, the true power and reach of the society, and the role of his own family in all of it. All these questions weighed on his mind as they moved cautiously through the night. One thing was certain: there was no turning back. They were in the middle of something much bigger than they had ever imagined, and the answers they sought could redefine the future of the entire country. With the precious documents secure in his backpack and Emily by his side, Richard prepared for the next chapter of this dangerous journey. The path ahead was uncertain and fraught with peril, but the truth, and perhaps redemption, awaited at the end. The dawn began to tinge the sky when Richard and Emily finally spotted the first houses of the small town. Exhausted, dirty, and scratched after the long trek through the forest, they could hardly believe they had made it safely. "There," Emily pointed, her voice hoarse from exhaustion. "Looks like a gas station. Maybe we can use the phone." They approached the establishment cautiously, alert for any suspicious movement. The gas station was quiet, with only a sleepy attendant behind the counter. "Good morning," Richard greeted, trying to appear as normal as possible despite his disheveled appearance. "Our car broke down on the road. Could we use the phone?" The attendant looked at them curiously but nodded, indicating a payphone in the corner. Emily quickly dialed, speaking in low tones. After a few minutes, she hung up and turned to Richard. "A friend of mine is coming to pick us up," she explained. "He's trustworthy and can take us back to Chicago without raising suspicions." While they waited, they bought coffee and some sandwiches, trying to regain their strength after the tumultuous night. Richard couldn't take his eyes off the backpack where they kept the documents, fearing that at any moment someone might appear to take them. About an hour later, an old worn-out car pulled up in front of the gas station. A middle-aged man with graying hair and thin-rimmed glasses stepped out of the vehicle. "Peter!" Emily exclaimed, hugging the newcomer. "Thanks for coming." Peter smiled gently. "Always at your service, Em. Let's get out of here quickly." In the car, Emily made the introductions. "Richard, this is Peter Olson. He was my journalism professor in college and now works as an independent researcher. Peter, this is Richard Anderson." Peter's eyes widened slightly at the surname. "Anderson? As in Anderson Enterprises?" Richard nodded, hesitant. "Yes, that was my family's company. But now, well, it's a long story. And one we need to tell you, Peter," Emily added. "But not here. We need to go to a safe place first." Peter agreed, focusing on the road. "I know just the place." A few hours later, they arrived at a small farmhouse on the outskirts of Chicago. The property seemed isolated and well protected, with an electronic gate and discreet security cameras. "Welcome to my hideout," Peter announced, parking the car. "Here we can talk without fear of being overheard." Once inside the house, comfortably settled in the living room with steaming cups of coffee, Richard and Emily began to tell their story. Peter listened attentively, his face growing more serious as they revealed the details about the society and their recent discoveries. When they finished, Peter was silent for a long moment, clearly processing everything he had heard. "This is incredible," he finally said. "I've always suspected there was something like this behind the scenes of power, but I never imagined it was so extensive or so old." "Have you heard anything about this before, Peter?" Emily asked. He nodded slowly. "Rumors, mostly. Over the years in my investigations, I've always bumped into certain names, certain connections that seem to go beyond the normal. But I never got concrete proof." Richard opened the backpack, carefully spreading the documents they had found on the coffee table. "Well, I think we now have some of that proof." Peter examined the papers with growing interest. "This is explosive," he murmured. "If we can confirm the authenticity of these documents and connect the dots, we could expose the entire operation," Emily concluded. Richard, however, seemed hesitant. "But at what cost? These people are powerful. They're already after us. If we make this public, they'll come at us with everything they've got," Peter completed, nodding gravely. "You need to understand the risks. This isn't just about exposing some corrupt politicians or dishonest businessmen. We're talking about a power structure that's existed for generations. They won't give up easily." A heavy silence fell over the room as everyone considered the implications. "So what do we do?" Richard asked finally. Peter stood up, walking to a bookshelf filled with books and folders. He pulled out a thick volume and opened it, revealing a hidden compartment inside. From there, he retrieved a flash drive. "Over the years, I've gathered my own collection of suspicious information," he explained. "Nothing as concrete as what you've found, but perhaps together we can start to piece together the full puzzle." Emily smiled, a glint of determination in her eyes. "Looks like we've just formed an investigative team." Richard looked at the two, feeling a mix of fear and hope. "Are you sure you want to get involved in this? It's dangerous." Peter placed a comforting hand on Richard's shoulder. "Young man, I've spent my entire life seeking the truth. I'm not going to back down now that we finally have a real chance to make a difference." Emily nodded in agreement. "Besides, we're already involved. Better to fight than to wait for them to find us." Richard took a deep breath, feeling the weight of responsibility, but also a growing determination. "Okay then, where do we start?" Peter smiled, a glint of enthusiasm in his eyes. "First, we need to organize and analyze everything we have. Then we'll draw connections, identify the key players, and find the weak links in their chain." "And then?" Emily asked. "Then," Peter replied, his voice full of conviction, "we'll build a case so solid that not even the society will be able to cover it up." As the sun set outside, the three of them pored over the documents, beginning what would be a long and dangerous journey in search of the truth. Richard knew that the path ahead would be difficult, but for the first time since it all began, he felt he had a real chance to not only unravel the mystery of his past, but also to make a difference in the future of his country. The night fell over the farmhouse, but inside the light of truth began to shine brighter than ever. The days that followed were a frenetic mix of investigation, analysis, and planning. Peter's farmhouse transformed into an improvised operations center, with walls covered in maps, photos, and diagrams connected by colored strings, creating a visual web of the conspiracy they were unraveling. Richard, Emily, and Peter worked tirelessly, sleeping little, and living on coffee and food discreetly delivered by Peter's trusted contacts. Each new discovery took them deeper into the rabbit hole, revealing layer upon layer of corruption and manipulation that spanned decades. One morning, Emily burst into the room with wide-eyed excitement. "You're not going to believe what I found," she exclaimed, spreading some papers on the table. "Remember that politician we mentioned, Senator Harris? Well, I managed to trace some of his financial transactions through a contact at the bank. Look at this." Richard and Peter leaned over the documents. What they saw left them speechless. A series of substantial transfers to offshore accounts, all coinciding with dates of crucial votes in the Senate. "This is unbelievable," Peter murmured, adjusting his glasses. "This is the concrete proof we've been looking for of how the society directly influences political decisions." Richard nodded, feeling a mix of triumph and apprehension. "With this, we can start dismantling their entire operation, but it also means we've become even bigger targets. As if to confirm his words, Emily's phone rang at that moment. She answered, her expression quickly changing from curiosity to concern. "It was my police contact," she said after hanging up. "Apparently, there's a search and seizure warrant for my house and Richard's apartment. They're officially looking for us now." A heavy silence fell over the trio. The reality of their situation hit them with full force. There was no turning back. "They must have found out we're investigating," Peter said, his voice laden with worry. "We need to act fast before they find us." Richard felt a wave of determination wash over him. "We can't back down now. We're so close to exposing everything. We need to find a way to get the word out before it's too late." Emily nodded, her eyes shining with resolve. "I have some contacts in the international press. If we can get all the information to them, it'll be harder for the society to cover it up." "Good idea," Peter agreed. "But we need to be careful. We can't just send everything at once. We need a plan." The three spent the next hours meticulously crafting a strategy. They decided to divide the information into packages and send them to different journalists and media outlets around the world. Each package would contain part of the puzzle, but none would have enough information to immediately endanger their recipients. As they worked, Richard couldn't help but think about how his life had changed. Just a few months ago, he was a broken, directionless man. Now he was at the center of a conspiracy that could change the course of history. As the night wore on, they finalized their preparations. Everything was ready to be sent the next morning. "Well, I guess that's it," Emily said, a mix of nervousness and excitement in her voice. "Tomorrow, we change the game." Peter smiled wearily. "You two have done an incredible job. Your grandfather would be proud, Richard." Richard felt a lump in his throat at the thought of his grandfather. "I hope so. I hope we're doing the right thing." They decided to try to get some sleep, knowing the next day would be crucial. Richard lay down, but sleep didn't come easily. His mind was filled with thoughts about what the future held. It was in the middle of the night that the sound of breaking glass abruptly woke them. "They've found us," Peter shouted, running down the hallway. "Quick, grab everything and go. To the basement." Richard's heart raced as he and Emily scrambled to gather the documents and essential equipment. They could hear the sound of heavy footsteps breaking into the house. In the basement, Peter activated a secret door that led to a tunnel. "This tunnel will take you out of the property," he explained hurriedly. "Go, I'll delay them." "Peter, no," Emily protested. "Come with us." The old journalist smiled sadly. "Someone needs to stay behind to make sure you escape. Besides," he added with a glint in his eyes, "I've always wanted to be a hero." With tears in their eyes, Richard and Emily entered the tunnel. The sound of shouts and things being broken echoed behind them as they ran through the dark passage. After what felt like an eternity, they emerged in a forest clearing. The distant sound of sirens could be heard. "And now?" Richard asked, panting. Emily looked at the bag she carried, full of evidence that could change everything. "Now we complete the mission. For Peter, for your grandfather, for everyone who's been silenced." With one last look back, they plunged into the darkness of the forest, carrying with them the weight of the truth and the hope of a different future. The net had closed in, but the battle was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. Dawn found Richard and Emily exhausted, dirty, and hidden in a small roadside motel on the outskirts of Chicago. They had spent the entire night on the move, always looking over their shoulders, fearing they were being followed. "We have to act fast," Emily said, her face a mask of determination despite the evident exhaustion. "We don't know how much time we have before they find us again." Richard nodded, powering up the laptop they had managed to save in the escape. "Let's start sending the information packages. If we can spread everything before they catch us, we'll have a chance." With fingers trembling from exhaustion and adrenaline, they began sending encrypted emails to Emily's contacts in the international press. Each message contained a piece of the puzzle: financial documents, transcripts of recorded conversations, compromising photos, all carefully organized to tell the story of the society and its nefarious influence. As they worked, the television in the corner of the room played the morning news. Suddenly, a headline caught their attention. "Breaking news. Veteran journalist Peter Olson arrested on charges of conspiracy and possession of stolen documents." Emily let out a distressed groan. "Oh, Peter." Richard placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. He knew the risks. The best we can do now is make sure his sacrifice wasn't in vain. With renewed determination, they returned to work. The hours passed in a blur of frenetic activity, interrupted only by brief breaks for coffee and quick snacks. Around noon, Emily received an encrypted message from one of her contacts. Her eyes widened as she read it. "Richard," she called, her voice trembling slightly. "It's starting. The Guardian just published the first part of the story." They rushed to check online. There it was, in bold letters on the front page of the British newspaper's website. "Global scandal, secret society controls American politics and economy for decades." In the minutes and hours that followed, it was as if a dam had burst. Newspapers and news sites around the world began publishing parts of the story, each revealing a different aspect of the conspiracy. The hashtag #YinSecretSociety quickly became a global trending topic on Twitter. Richard and Emily watched, stunned, as the fruit of their work spread across the world. It was a surreal mix of triumph and terror. They had succeeded in exposing the truth, but they also knew they were now the most wanted people in the country. As the afternoon progressed, the repercussions began to pile up. Politicians mentioned in the documents made hasty statements, denying involvement. Executives of major companies announced temporary leaves of absence. The Chicago Stock Exchange went into freefall. "It's happening," Richard murmured, half in disbelief. "It's really happening." Emily nodded, a tired smile on her face. "Yes, but our fight isn't over yet. We have to make sure the full story gets told." At that moment, Richard's phone rang. The number was unknown. With his heart in his throat, he answered. "Hello? Richard?" A familiar voice on the other end made him freeze. "It's Carl, your former assistant. Look, I know you have no reason to trust me, but I need to tell you something. Something about your grandfather and Jerome." Richard signaled for Emily to come closer, putting the phone on speaker. "I'm listening, Carl." "Your grandfather? He didn't give up the fight against the society. He continued in secret for years. And Jerome, he's alive, Richard." The shock of the revelation made Richard stagger. "What? How do you know that?" "Because I've been working with them in secret for years," Carl replied. "We formed a resistance within the society itself, and now with what you and Emily have done, we can finally act openly." Richard and Emily exchanged looks of astonishment. This was a development they couldn't have anticipated. "Carl," Emily interjected, "we need to meet. Where are you?" "I'm on my way to you," Carl replied. "I have a safe place where we can gather and plan the next steps. Jerome wants to meet you, Richard. He has a lot to explain." As they hung up the phone, Richard felt a wave of emotions wash over him. Relief at knowing his grandfather hadn't given up. Shock at learning Jerome was alive, and a growing sense that this story was far from over. "What do we do now?" he asked Emily. She smiled, a glint of determination in her eyes. Now we finish what we started. We'll meet Jerome, hear what he has to say, and then we change America for good." As they prepared to leave the motel and meet Carl, Richard couldn't help but think about how his life had changed. From a bankrupt businessman to one of the key players in a silent revolution that was shaking the foundations of power in the country. The truth had come to light. But this was only the first wave. The tsunami that would follow promised to completely reshape the political and economic landscape of America. And Richard, along with Emily, would be at the center of it all. With one last look at the laptop screen, where the headlines continued to multiply, they grabbed their things and stepped out. The next chapter of this extraordinary saga awaited them, and with it the promise of a new dawn for America. The twilight painted the sky of Chicago with shades of orange and red as Richard and Emily arrived at the meeting place with Carl. It was an old warehouse on the outskirts of the city, seemingly abandoned but with subtle signs of recent activity. Carl waited at the entrance, his face a mix of anxiety and relief. "Quick, come in," he whispered, looking nervously around. The interior of the warehouse was surprisingly well equipped. Computers, servers, and communication equipment occupied a large part of the space. But what really caught Richard's attention was the group of people gathered in the center, and there, in the middle of them, was a man who made his heart skip a beat. "Jerome," Richard murmured, immediately recognizing the man's face from the old photographs, now aged but with the same sharp eyes. Jerome stood up, a tired smile on his wrinkled face. "Richard," he said, his voice hoarse with age and emotion. "We finally meet." The two men stared at each other for a moment, decades of history and secrets hanging between them. Then, to everyone's surprise, Jerome stepped forward and embraced Richard tightly. "Your grandfather would be so proud," he murmured. "You've done what we couldn't." When they separated, Richard had thousands of questions running through his mind, but before he could articulate any of them, Jerome gestured for everyone to sit. "I know you have many questions," he began, "and I'll do my best to answer them all. But first, you need to understand the true history of the society and why your grandfather and I did what we did." In the hours that followed, Jerome unfolded a narrative that left Richard and Emily speechless. The society, he explained, had started with noble intentions. A group of idealistic businessmen and politicians who believed they could guide America to a better future, away from the public eye. "In the beginning, we truly believed we were doing the right thing," Jerome said, his eyes lost in distant memories. "But power is a dangerous thing. Slowly, some members began using our influence for personal gain. When your grandfather and I realized what was happening, it was too late." He told them how they had tried to expose the corruption within the society, but were outmaneuvered. Jerome's disappearance was staged, a desperate move to protect his life and continue the fight from the shadows. "Your grandfather had to pretend he had fallen in line," Jerome explained to Richard. "He stayed in the society, passing information to me in secret. That's how we built our resistance network over the years." Richard felt a wave of emotions wash over him. Pride for his grandfather, anger at the injustice, and a renewed determination to finish what they had started. "And now?" Emily asked, breaking the silence that had fallen over the group. "What do we do with all this information?" Jerome smiled, a glint of hope in his tired eyes. "Now, my young friends, we finish what we started so many years ago. Thanks. To you, the whole world is watching. It's our chance to really change things." Carl stepped forward carrying a laptop. "We have contacts in practically every sphere of government and the private sector. People who, like us, want to see real change. With the evidence you've exposed and our internal network, we can push for genuine reforms." The next hours were a whirlwind of planning and strategy. Richard, Emily, and Jerome's team worked tirelessly, preparing documents, organizing evidence, and mapping out plans of action. As they worked, Richard found himself reflecting on the incredible journey that had brought him here. From a broken, directionless man, he was now at the center of a movement that could redefine the future of his country. Outside, the lights of Chicago shone against the night sky, a reminder of the world they were fighting to change. Richard knew the days ahead would be difficult. There would be resistance, threats, and attempts to discredit their work. But looking around at the determined faces of Emily, Jerome, Carl, and all the others who had joined the cause, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. As the new day approached, bringing with it the promise of change and challenges, Richard prepared to face whatever came his way. He knew this wasn't just a fight for justice or personal redemption. It was a battle for the future of America, and he was ready to lead it. Dawn was coming, not just in the sky, but for the country. And with it, the promise of a new beginning, built on the foundations of truth and justice they had fought so hard to reveal. Richard looked out the warehouse window, watching the first rays of sunlight touch the horizon. A new day was dawning, and with it, the hope of a better America. The journey was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, the future seemed bright and full of possibilities. The months that followed were a roller coaster of emotions, challenges, and finally, triumphs. Richard, Emily, and Jerome's team worked tirelessly, navigating a minefield of politics, media, and public opinion. The initial exposure of the society was just the beginning. With each new revelation, each leaked document, and each courageous testimony, The power of the old order began to crumble. There were moments of real danger, attempts to discredit the team, veiled threats, and even a foiled assassination attempt on Richard's life. But for every obstacle, they found unexpected allies, brave journalists, honest politicians who had been waiting for an opportunity like this, and ordinary citizens inspired to speak out. The international media continued to cover the case, keeping the world's eyes on America. Peaceful protests erupted across the country, with millions of people demanding reforms and accountability. 6 months after the initial revelation, Congress, pressured by public opinion and irrefutable evidence, passed a series of unprecedented anti-corruption reforms. A special commission was formed to thoroughly investigate all allegations related to the society. Richard testified before this commission, telling his story and presenting the evidence he and his team had gathered. It was a surreal moment, standing in the heart of the legislative power, speaking truths that had been suppressed for so long. A year after it all began, the first trials started. Powerful figures who once seemed untouchable now faced justice. With each verdict, Richard felt a mix of satisfaction and sorrow. Satisfaction at seeing justice served, sorrow for the lost years and affected lives. Emily, meanwhile, became one of the most respected journalists in the country. Her tireless work in uncovering the truth and her courage in facing threats made her a symbol of journalistic integrity. Jerome, though he preferred to remain in the background, became a valuable advisor to the Reform Commission. His decades of experience and insider knowledge of the society were instrumental in creating safeguards against future abuses of power. On a sunny afternoon, 2 years after the start of their journey, Richard found himself once again at the old Anderson Enterprises headquarters. The building, once a symbol of his personal failure and his family's dark secrets, was now being transformed. "What do you think?" Emily asked, standing beside him, looking at the renovated facade. Richard smiled, a mix of nostalgia and hope in his eyes. "I think it's perfect." The building was being converted into a center for transparency and civic education, a place where citizens could learn about their rights, where investigative journalists could work without fear, and where the lessons of the past would be preserved for future generations. As they watched the workers putting up the new sign, the Anderson Evans Institute for Democracy and Transparency, Richard couldn't help but think about how far they had come. "Your grandfather and Jerome would be proud," Emily said softly. Intertwining her fingers with Richard's, he nodded, feeling a lump in his throat. "Sometimes it's still hard to believe everything that's happened." "Well, believe it," a familiar voice said behind them. It was Carl, now the operations director of the new institute. "You've changed the country, changed the world." The E3 stood there for a moment, contemplating the future they had helped shape. America still faced challenges, of course. Corruption and injustice don't disappear overnight. But now there was hope, there was transparency, and most importantly, there was an engaged and vigilant citizenry. That night, at a celebratory dinner with the team, Jerome raised a toast. His voice, though weakened by age, still carried the weight of history and the promise of the future. "To all of you," he said, looking around the table at the faces that had become like family, "who had the courage to face the darkness and bring the light of truth. The road ahead is still long, but thanks to you, it's a road we can now see clearly." Richard looked at Emily, at Carl, at the faces of all those who had risked everything for the truth. He thought of his grandfather, of a young Jerome, of the sacrifices they had made and the seeds they had planted. When he raised his glass, Richard felt the weight of history and the lightness of hope. "To the future," he said, "and to the truth." That set us free. The glasses clinked, echoing with the promise of a new dawn for America. A dawn built on the foundations of truth, justice, and the courage of those who dared to challenge the status quo. Outside, the lights of Chicago shone against the night sky, no longer hiding dark secrets, but illuminating the path to a brighter future. A future that Richard, Emily, and all the others had helped create, word by word, action by action, truth by truth. And so, with a heart full of gratitude and determination, Richard looked to the horizon, ready to face the challenges that still lay ahead. For he knew that this was not the end of the story, but only the beginning of a new chapter. Not just for him, but for all of America. The sun set over the city, but for Richard and for the country, a new day was just beginning. A day illuminated by the light of truth and the promise of a better future for all.